A bit early, but it's okay. Yeah. It's good. I got got to touch base with some people this afternoon, including some of the folks at the Palestine program, at the SXP Center for Health and Human Rights. Yeah, exactly.
You would do that improv. Wait, can we do this now? Good idea. That would feel great. And just ask the audience situation. And then we just
Hi, everyone. In the interest of time, I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming today to our event on cross-cultural solidarity for Palestine. My name is Jackie. I'm an M1 in the Pathways program. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm going to be moderating. I'm going to give a quick introduction to Dr. Ge, and then we will have a few set questions. And then I really want to spend most of the time for audience Q&A. So please think of things you want to ask him during this time. Dr. Yipeng Ge is a family medicine physician based in Ottawa. He received his MPH at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health here in Boston and his MD from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Ge is passionate about tackling health and social inequities by addressing the social and broader determinants of health, including anti-racism work and practice in medical education. Most recently, Dr. Ge has focused his advocacy efforts on the ongoing genocide and health crisis in Gaza. In November of 2023, Dr. Ge was suspended by his residency program over accusations that his activism was, quote, anti-Semitic and unprofessional. In response, there was a widespread call from across the globe for Dr. Ge to be reinstated. An online petition in support of him garnered 65,000 signatures. In January of 2024, Dr. Ge was reinstated by the University of Ottawa's Family Medicine Residency Program. But despite this reinstatement, Dr. Ge has chosen not to return due to the irreparable harm this process has caused. Most recently, Dr. Ge has returned from a week-long medical mission to Rafah, Gaza's most southernmost city. We welcome Dr. Ge here today to share his expertise in medical advocacy and anti-racism, especially as it pertains to Palestine and cross-cultural solidarity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yipeng Ge. So first, kind of just like a general question, can you start by telling us how you got involved in medical advocacy and activism and what drew you to this line of work?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me? Is this better? Yeah, thank you so much for having me. What drew me into this space, I think maybe I'll start with I think positioning myself and sharing a little bit about, I think, my own identity and how I, not by accident, I think, stumbled upon the topic and issue of Palestine. So I identify as Chinese Canadian. I was born in a place called Wuhan, China, to Chinese parents, but briefly grew up in Japan. And then at the age of 4, I came to Canada. And around grade 5, I got something called Canadian citizenship. I was just kind of handed that to me because my parents passed a test. And growing up, because of the different kind of opportunities and resources and privileges I had access to as a Canadian, I often reflected on that because of my dad's upbringing and the way in which both my parents would kind of shed light onto the different resources, opportunities that my extended family would have access to or not have access to in places like Japan and China, where most of my extended family are. And it was also the experience of, I think, visiting my dad's hometown in rural Shandong, where he was a garlic farmer, and we still have an uncle there that farms garlic. and knowing the different access to resources, different access to education, all these social determinants of health that are so important for not only health, but being able to live a long, fulfilling life. And the privilege that I've had to be able to actually go back to the place where my dad's roots are, where my family's roots are, and to know that such an experience is completely forbidden for Palestinians and also for other peoples in this world that are victim to settler colonialism. And so growing up with that kind of reflection of what it means to be Canadian, and entering the space of like academia and university, I had the opportunity to learn about First Nations, Métis and Inuit health or Indigenous health in the context of Canada. And really, I think having a reframing and a crushing like opportunity to bear witness in the context of colonial Canada, that of the ongoing and historical genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada and what it means to benefit from stolen land in Canada as an immigrant, as someone who benefits from the settler colonial state of Canada. And so I had an opportunity, I think, to turn away from those injustices or lean into it and think about how do I do my work as an ally or as an accomplice in this space of anti-racism, decolonizing work in the context of Canada. And so for the past 8 years in medical training and also in public health work, I've really spent my time looking at health inequities, structural determinants of health, including that of colonialism, and thinking about how do you decolonize or look at anti-racist approaches and frameworks in health and healthcare and public health spaces. And it's from that framing that I came to Harvard last year to do my Master's of Public Health and study structural oppression and racism and colonialism and imperialism in different contexts, and learned about something called the Palestine Trek. And in preparation for bearing witness and reflecting on my own privilege, immense privilege as a non-Palestinian to be able to go to occupied West Bank when I have Palestinian friends that do not even have said privilege for fear of deportation or being jailed or being tortured while being jailed. But that was my work, and that is my ongoing work of figuring out what is my role and what is my space in a movement for a free Palestine. But it was through that experience of studying and, as any graduate student that does, you get the reading lists, you do the readings, and then you write. And so I wrote a paper about healthcare under occupation and what it was like for decades for people to live under occupation and apartheid and the limitations on health and human rights. It was from that framing in which I've had the privilege, immense privilege of learning about Palestine and the insidious and ongoing impacts of Zionism through the ongoing Nakba that began in 1948. But the roots of said oppression, in that territory also go beyond that, recognizing the impacts of the Ottoman Empire and the British occupation as well. But once again, we see Palestinians are experiencing this ongoing Nakba through this lens of Zionist settler colonialism. And so what happened, I think, on October 7th, as I bear witness to what happened in occupied West Bank for the past many years, and having the experience of understanding that framing, as anyone would do, that feels like powerless as an individual going against this machine of settler colonialism and these structural oppressions, is I went to social media to share my solidarity. And I didn't think many people were paying attention, quite honestly. It was really just, I think, sharing materials and resources from sources like MSF, the United Nations, WHO, Jewish Voice for Peace, even sharing a teach-in event here at Harvard University featuring the Palestine program and some folks that I just met this afternoon. And these social media posts were all screenshotted. by former colleagues of mine from medical school on my private Instagram at that point, and circulated to other people, including people that I do not know and I do not have a relationship with. And these people, one said individual who's a physician colleague ended up posting, instead of even approaching me for a conversation, sharing my social media posts and framing it in a very inflammatory, hateful, defamatory way, framing it as anti-Semitic. And we know that these tactics of suppression and reprisals have been widespread. And this kind of chilling effect is plaguing not only academic institutions, but workplaces across North America, but also in places like the United Kingdom. Ironically, these places that uphold their own version of settler colonialism. And I think that, I think I can keep going about this, but I do want to have a dialogue. So, but I think I'll just end up by saying, it's from that framing that I've had the opportunity to learn, but also be a scholar in this area. And when you know what you know, then you try to do better. And certainly when you know right from wrong, and you know who you are from that kind of framing of when we present ourselves in any kind of solidarity work from a position of understanding our own identity, at the same time understanding our own privilege and the role that we play in any kind of solidarity work, especially as it pertains to Palestine. And the flip side of that coin is understanding how oppression, especially at the individual level, can limit the way in which we can fully, authentically present ourselves. But it's from that framing that I feel like I've been able to withstand these attacks, knowing that I have people that care about me, love me, and support me, and they know who I am, and I know who I am. And so these attacks ultimately do not withstand the test of time. Like the University of Ottawa ultimately ended up rescinding their indefinite suspension and without any disciplinary action against me, because there was nothing there to actually investigate. But that initial framing of anti-Semitism for anything related to health and human rights for Palestine is inherently racist and discriminatory in of itself. And so we need, I think, to all recognize that and call it out from the get-go. But sometimes in the case of my situation, there was no opportunity. The way in which I was suspended was a phone call on a Sunday morning at 8 o'clock in the morning by someone who wasn't even involved in the decision, because they couldn't even face me themselves, to tell me I was suspended for an indefinite amount of time, and without even giving me the social media post in question or the grounds in which I was suspended. That came almost 2 weeks into my suspension after I had retained legal counsel.
Thank you I really appreciate you outlining your whole story. And I think where you kind of left off leads me into the next question, because I mean, I can't imagine how getting that call on like a Sunday morning must have felt and like the aftermath. And I think you went into a little bit of how you dealt with it and how you kind of managed emotionally during that. But I'm curious a little bit more, because I think a lot of us operate within academia. Like I'm in medical school right now, and in order to get that degree, I have to be within the system. And I'm curious how that decision changed your perspective on medicine, and in particular academic medicine, and operating within that system.
Because my training has been in Indigenous health and health disparities in the context of so-called Canada, even before entering medical school and public health work during my undergrad, I knew full well the violent and harmful systems that are upheld by institutions like medicine. I can list off a few examples, that of forced sterilization, nutritional experiments on Indigenous children, the justification for eugenics or slavery. These are systems of oppression that medicine, if you only just look a few decades before, has been able to uphold. So I think I knew that medicine in of itself is extremely harmful, violent, and structurally oppressive as even a discipline and as a profession. And I think there's a role for people to try to change these systems from within. And that's why I went into medicine, recognizing that sometimes you have to be able to get the credentials, be able to get the training so that you can provide the care that you care for the patients and the communities that you deeply care about. And I think ultimately what failed on their part is they also don't understand, they being the institutions that decided to take disciplinary or like retaliatory actions against me, both the University of Ottawa and the Canadian Medical Association, for which I was a board member before I resigned in December. This is the national organization that represents physicians and medical learners in Canada, the equivalent of the American Medical Association. And for these institutions to take retaliatory actions against me in their framing in of itself is racist and discriminatory, but I think they fundamentally didn't understand who I was, but also like the work that I do, that I'm a scholar, but also a practitioner of anti-racism and what it means to decolonize health and healthcare in of itself. And without them understanding that, I think they also didn't really understand what it means to be a public health and preventive medicine resident trainee. So I had actually finished my family medicine training a year ago, and I finished my master's of public health here at the public health school at Harvard last year as well. And so I recognize I'm not in the same position as some of my medical student colleagues who I've also bared witness to in respect to their cases related to social media facing suspensions and even expulsions at the University of Ottawa. They're not in the same positions that I am in. I have the opportunity, because I have my family medicine degree, because I have my master's of public health, I have that privilege to step away from them. They don't have anything truly meaningful left that's hanging in the balance for me. I mean, there's the public health and preventive medicine residency, training that I'm honestly not sure if I'm going to finish at this point, because I'm just quite tired of having institutional power over me. And I've had, over the past couple of months, a degree of freedom and control over my own schedule and over dedicating my time to things that I care about, including centering the Palestinians in Gaza that are experiencing ongoing genocide. And that's what this has all been about. And for them to kind of waste my time and resources through their discriminatory actions or retaliatory actions is such a distraction and a waste of so many people's resources. But it is an important front line because of how we know medicine as an institution in Canada, around the world, is structurally harmful and violent to so many patients, to so many communities that are marginalized and racialized. And I'm not of the kind of like area of academia or study to just document health disparities. I think we've done so much of that. And we need to question why such disparities exist in the first place, that of structural racism. And it wasn't always called like anti-racist or anti-racism work. It was only really after, I think a large shift of it was really only after the death of George Floyd in 2020. And then there's someone called Joyce Echequan, who died in 2020 as well in Canada, in a place in Quebec, in an emergency room. She's a First Nations Indigenous woman who had to videotape on her phone her own murder, essentially, in the emergency department, because the nurses there did not take her medical issues seriously. And she died at the hands of nurses, at the hands of doctors in the healthcare system in Canada. And so these are only, just examples that, and I can, there's also the case of Brian Sinclair, who was ignored to death in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada, because the doctors and nurses, saw a First Nations man, an Indigenous man, and immediately thought of, oh, this person is intoxicated with alcohol poisoning or is an alcohol withdrawal, and didn't have the foresight to actually catch sepsis, a bacterial infection in the blood. And then there's the case of Jordan River Anderson, a First Nations child who basically didn't ever have the chance to be in a loving home and died in hospital because the federal government and the provincial government in Canada couldn't decide who would foot the bill. And so these things are so deeply interconnected with how the healthcare system operates, but also how these colonial policies discriminate and ultimately kill certain bodies in this world. And it's about dehumanizing language, but it's also about policies and structures within healthcare that dehumanize. And so when, I think all of this happened in my situation, I know that we operate within these movements as individuals as well. So the actions in which I make as an individual not only affect myself, but they affect my community and the people that are watching what's happening. And so I think it's from that positioning, knowing that I cannot, compromise my own values and principles by upholding these systems any longer. I've done what I can to, reach across the aisle, really, with patience, with humility, with grace and compassion for other people. And I had a lot of conversations with senior leadership within the University of Ottawa, within the senior leadership of the Canadian Medical Association. But what I saw was a lot of upholding of said racism without the acknowledgement of harm to not only to me, but the many communities that are in the diaspora in Canada and around the world that are bearing witness and also, I think, will be impacted for generations to come because of the lack of inaction around calling out very basic attacks on healthcare in Gaza, for example. There's a group of healthcare workers, actually over 1,200, that sent a letter to the Canadian Medical Association over 2 weeks ago, calling for very basic things like calling for a ceasefire, saying that hospitals and healthcare workers shouldn't be targeted and killed and bombed, and that humanitarian aid should enter unrestricted, that meets the population's needs. And the Canadian Medical Association actually doubled down and said, well, you know what our stance is, and we're not going to put out a statement. When we know that the Canadian Medical Association has actually put out multiple statements related to Ukraine, has actually divested from the Russian Federation and made that announcement when Ukraine was, when that escalation of conflict happened in Ukraine, and actually contributed $250,000 of humanitarian aid for Ukraine. And when we see none of that happen for Palestine, and just absolute radio silence, then we have to call it out. And we also, I think, recognize, the way in which I was suspended at the University of Ottawa was for quote unquote professionalism concerns. But what I've witnessed from a lot of my physician colleagues is a lack of professionalism on their part. And so ultimately I've had to respond mindfully and make decisions as I go that align with my values and principles, knowing also the communities that I care about, the issues that I care about, that of Palestine, are not being respected in those spaces. And so it's within my power to do everything that I can to call attention to the ongoing genocide, and some of the mechanisms in which I've used as over the past couple of months have all been within my power to be able to draw attention to these structural issues in the hopes of eventually dismantling them.
I appreciate you calling out the idea that professionalism can also be coded in colonialism and racism. I think I'm going to move on to one final prepared question, just so we have plenty of time for audience questions. The last one is a bit of a segue. I'm curious to hear more about your medical mission to Rafa. your experiences there and what advice you have for us as medical students as to how to get involved, even if we aren't on the ground and if we don't have the capacity to be on the ground.
It's interesting because the experience that I had with my suspension and then my eventual resignation from the Canadian Medical Association because of their intimidation and bullying has brought me closer to a lot of people that I care about and that care about me, but also has brought amazing new relationships, including physicians that do a lot of humanitarian medical work, including having previously worked in Gaza. And it's through doctors like Dr. Ben Thompson, who's a nephrologist in Toronto who just got back from Gaza himself, who supported me throughout my suspension because he was suspended by his hospital, and now he's actually suing the hospital. And Dr. Tarek Lubani, who runs an organization called GLIA, and it was through that organization that we were able to enter Rafah to do some primary care work and bring in medications and supplies. And then Dr. Fozia Alvi, who runs an organization called Humanity Auxilium, who's done a lot of work in other places, including Pakistan and Bangladesh, and has dedicated all her time and resources now to really to Gaza because of how bad it's gotten. And it's I didn't know these three doctors before my suspension, but because of my suspension, I've met people like them and had the privilege of once again centering people who are experiencing the unimaginable and doing everything within my power. I'm trained in family medicine. I've trained in emergency rooms across the country in Canada, including up north in places like Iqaluit, Nunavut, which I thought was under-resourced, which is under-resourced in the context of Canada, but there's nothing that compares to what we experienced in Rafah. And I think I've heard a lot of other doctors that have worked in a lot of other, like Dr. Yasser Khan, who's an ophthalmologist who does very specialized eye surgeries. He's taken out so many eyes in Gaza. He just got back from his second mission. He's been there twice since October 7th now. He's worked in so many different contexts, different post-conflict, conflict zones, but there's nothing that compares to what's happening in Gaza in two specific ways that I think can be highlighted. One is that there's a really structural systemic targeting of healthcare. There's basically no functioning hospital. The ones that are semi-functional, they're all under siege and attack, with Al-Shifa in the north, Al-Amal in the south in Khan Yunis, Al-Nasser in Khan Yunis. People have been evacuated at gunpoint. Doctors have been detained, arrested, tortured, and then some released and some actually executed in front of their patients. And there's horrific sexual violence that is happening in Al-Shifa Hospital. And this kind of systemic targeting of healthcare infrastructure and healthcare workers hasn't been seen in any other circumstance, any other conflict in the world, let alone all the other things that this genocidal campaign in Gaza that's unfolding it has broken a lot of other records as well. The other component is the structural and systemic withholding of food, clean water, and other kinds of aid, including medications. There's land borders that certain land borders that are actually Israeli protesters that are withholding the trucks from entering. But there's the Rafah border crossing, which doesn't have Israeli presence on the ground, operated by the Egyptians. And yet there's over 2,000 trucks ready to send in aid. And very little is getting in. If anything, certain days, there's no trucks that are actually getting in. And some of this aid is actually being expired. And so they're just throwing it out at the edge of the border, on the other side. And the arbitrary ways in which things get screened as to what is let in. Like Dr. Fozia's organization, Humanity Oxalum, has tried to send aid and has realized it's kind of like a failing thing to do, because their truck got to the front of the line and then it goes a few kilometers south to an Israeli inspection location. And then they just look through the boxes and they're like, oh, you have like bottles of water in here. We're not accepting bottles of water today. So all of the bottles of water needs to be thrown out and your truck actually needs to go to the end of the line. And to the end of the line is to wait like another 4 weeks to possibly get to the front of the line. And these organizations are paying for the drivers, paying for the fuel, for these trucks to just wait in line. And so this structural and systemic withholding of food, clean water, aid, I don't think we've seen this in any other context as well. So with these two out of like many other, documented things like the destruction of universities, destruction, like targeting of journalists, like they're being investigated for suspected genocide at the highest international justice court, the International Court of Justice. With all these things, and yet they continue, right? It continues to get worse each and every day. We think we've like heard or seen the worst, but it seems like every day or every other day, there's like a new thing that surprises us and also doesn't. I think it surprises us in a way that, it's a stain on our own humanity to recognize, wow, what's happening there could actually happen anywhere. That the weapons that get tested in Gaza actually get bought by other countries. And where will those weapons be used? They will be used on other people in the world. And so, anyways, I'll just say, like, with caring for patients in that overall situation, it's heartbreaking because, and like, I don't want to dwell too much on this because I had the privilege of entering and caring for patients, and I also have the privilege of exiting. And so many doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers there do not have that privilege, and they continue with the moral distress that I do not know how they manage, with knowing that their patients need clean water and food, and they can't prescribe that, or shelter, decent shelter. Like, the majority of the population are homeless. They're living in tents. And so are some of the doctors and nurses. And they've also been without pay for like coming up on 5-6 months now, because there's a complete collapse of civil infrastructure. And I think the most distressing thing is not actually working there. It's actually coming back, because coming back to a place like the United States or Canada, to know that these are the most complicit enablers of said genocide, and continue to send money for arms, continue to do really like harmful performative acts, like drop aid from the air, which has killed people, which has actually fallen on hospitals and destroyed solar panels. So it's actually like destroying hospital infrastructure now, has landed in the sea. And there are like Palestinian men who have like lived through 5-6 months of the genocide, and they go and try to get food for their families and they die drowning. And to know that the systems in which, the society in which we operate in is enabling that. I have like friends and colleagues in Gaza who are checking in on me. They checked, actually a couple of them checked in on me today, because they have community there, right? Like there's a common experience of ongoing genocide, but they take care of each other, they support each other, they have so much generosity and care and compassion and so much life despite everything that's going on. And yet, or we're over here, policing, tone policing, censoring each other, saying like, oh, you can't. I've had a resident physician, actually so many colleagues come to me some of whom are just in tears because of their own experiences of anti-Palestinian racism in Canada. I've had a resident physician say their direct supervisor tell them, you should stop posting about Gaza, and you actually shouldn't call it a genocide. You can't call it a genocide. And if you actually keep posting about on social media about Gaza, then quote unquote, you're next. And because this supervisor knows me and what happened to me, and that resident also knows me. And so it was a direct threat to them to not even, call attention to health and human rights abuses unfolding in Gaza, which is the bare minimum, right? Like the bare minimum is sharing a social media post. And these are the things that are getting not only students in medicine, but there are like lawyers, there are people in other workplaces that are getting suspended, losing jobs, job offers being withheld. And I think it's a desperate attempt to try to like close these massive cracks in the propaganda and lies that Israel has maintained for decades, for generations. But in many ways, Gaza is freeing a lot of us from that narrative, freeing a lot of the people on the sidelines that are bearing witness and questioning why is this silencing happening, and ultimately what is this genocidal campaign about? And in many ways, Gaza and Palestine are freeing us all from said narratives before we can ultimately help free them with our actions here. So that was a long way to answer, I think, what I experienced in Rafah. But there's nothing more to say except, I went there and cared for some patients, brought some supplies and medications, but ultimately it was like shuffling deck chairs on a sinking ship, because I couldn't prescribe food, I couldn't prescribe water, and that's ultimately what they need. So there's no humanitarian solution to what's happening in Gaza right now. It's most certainly a political one, and unfortunately, we're sitting at the heart of the enabling monster. Actually, the United States, like so many political commentators have said, if the United States, if Biden's administration wants to end this genocide, it can.
I appreciate that long-winded answer. It was actually very thorough. And I also appreciate you naming the ways in which it feels the West is hypocritical in saying that, we laud freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and all this kind of stuff. And then when people do speak out, they face significant consequences and are silenced in that. And I think a lot of us resonate with that here at Harvard. With regard to that, I'm going to open up to audience questions. Does anybody have questions for Dr. Ge? I will pass the mic to you. Anything is on the table.
Thank you for sharing your experiences and like being very vulnerable. I guess I always keep on thinking, like you said, they need water, they need food. I'm a dietitian. I do my research in food insecurity, and it's been breaking my heart to be able to assess it and see that it's very prevalent among grad students and postdocs here at the school, in such a privileged institution. So I keep thinking back about like Palestinians and like what we could do to support them. How do you think that we, as folks who physically cannot go to Palestine, and I know that sharing is like important, but I don't think it's enough by any means. How do you think that we could continue to advocate that they get access to those? Well, the bare minimum is like a ceasefire, but like how do they get access to those humanitarian like aid supplies that they need to literally survive?
Thanks for the question, Noor. I think I'm in an interesting place and audience, like sitting at Harvard, sitting in the United States in Boston, like because of that last comment that I made about, the power of the United States to actually just stop this genocidal campaign. Like folks that are either American citizens or just like because of like being in the United States, you are so well positioned, I think, for political advocacy to actually really help end this, like doing whatever you can to also like bring in people into this movement, people that really, I think, do care about health and human rights, but do not feel like this issue is theirs to take on. And we just have to draw like really easy conclusions, maybe just the way and I did earlier, like our shared humanity, but also how do we show up for other communities when we see these human rights abuses. And so I think there are people that we can ultimately call in, people that know right from wrong, and just need to really see through some of the lies and the propaganda. I spoke to a group of Canadian senators earlier last week, and for American folks, like senators are kind of like in Canada, there's like the House of Commons for parliamentarians, and then the Senate is the other chamber in which bills also do get reviewed and sometimes started at that chamber as well. And some of the insightful things that I came across was people, even some of these senators, they see the material coming from Israel, and then they see material about health and human rights for Palestine, and then they're like, oh, there's so much misinformation everywhere, I just don't know what to trust. And so then they feel like they can't touch it at all. So then they move on and do other work. And so I think there's also a veiled, very clear fear of internalized anti-Semitism, of people being worried about being called out. And it's always about, oh my God, what if? But when you like challenge the status quo, when you challenge these systems of oppression, of course you're going to get backlash. I have a friend who does a lot of climate advocacy work, and in a recent campaign, they got a lot of pushback from the fossil fuel industry, and they were like, "Yes, we hit a nerve. We're doing something right." So I hope like more of us can actually recognize that when we do get that pushback from like the Zionist lobby, it means we're actually doing something right. We're challenging these narratives that have ultimately worked, because everything that we've done as an international community has ultimately failed the people of Gaza and continue to fail them. And so the political advocacy tools of, calling are like, I know folks, and ultimately I have to be honest, I'm not doing what some of my colleagues are doing, which is they're calling their members of parliament every day. They're writing to them every day. And it only takes like a couple of minutes. I ended up doing that one evening, and it took like 3 minutes to leave a voicemail, a very angry voicemail. And you can also have like a very an excellent like template from others to just read off. And you can do this every day, and someone on the other side actually has to sit through and listen to it and document and tally what is coming in from constituents. And so this is really powerful for like American citizens to do, because ultimately, if we look at the rhetoric of what's happening in Gaza, but also like at the hands of Israel, there's nothing that's going to stop them. They've made that clear. They've made that clear for decades. And so I think we need to put pressure on like the BDS campaign. Like there's all these different tactics that we need to strategically invest our time and energy in, and also strategically invest our time and energy into people around us and build power among us. And to not waste time with people that do not care about us, do not care about the people that we care about, do not care about the issues that we care about, and continuously welcome people in for a movement for self-determination and liberation of Palestinians.
Any other questions? Oh, let's see. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Hi there. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It's deeply moving and just getting your firsthand accounts. And yeah, also, I want to just say how much I appreciate you for being so courageous to stand up to this, and also to like to the University of Ottawa, and like all the people who are putting pressure on you. My actual question is, I'm really curious. So what was the process like to actually work in Rafah? So like, did you cross through Egypt, or like what sort of papers did it require? And yeah, I guess let's start with that.
Yeah, thanks for your comment and your question. I do want to say, I think like I don't think I'm that courageous. I think a lot of you probably have more courage than I, because I was self-censoring quite a bit before I got suspended, and because I know what happens, and I thought I was being careful, and I was being careful, and even in which the way that things happened to me, in the way that they did, up until only recently, like, was I at the receiving end of all these kind of issues, and I had to respond, and not the one actually making the narrative myself. And so I hope more people can actually define their own narrative, and because I was kind of just like outed, and had to face the consequences of that, and find a path forward that made sense, not only for me, but grounding myself in a broader movement as well. And I recognize, I'm non-Palestinian, and finding space in a movement that ultimately needs to center Palestinians that are experiencing the unimaginable. So my heroes, but also who I see as the most courageous, are the healthcare workers in Gaza that continue to do the work that they do despite everything that they're experiencing and facing. To answer your question, logistically, it was with those organizations that I mentioned, with Dr. Tarek and Dr. Fozia, we applied through the WHO to be an emergency medical team. And I was part of that first delegation sent with those organizations. So I went with Dr. Fozia. Dr. Tarek was supposed to go with us, but unfortunately he faced some challenges with the Egyptian authorities. You ultimately need approval from the WHO in principle for the delegation to enter. And then you get, then every person on the delegation gets screened and vetted by the Egyptian authorities and the Israeli authorities. And then once you get all of that, it's only days before you enter, actually. So we got our approvals days before we planned to enter Rafah. And we arrived in Cairo around 3 days before the planned entry, and gathered supplies, and then started in Cairo around like 4 a.m. in the morning from the UN Coordinating Office for Humanitarian Affairs office, and started with a UN convoy, and went from Cairo through the Sinai Peninsula to Rafah, and that's about an 8-9 hour journey because of the checkpoints, the militarized checkpoints, and then went through the Rafah border crossing, and had all the bags that we had. Between the four of us, we brought in 18 suitcases, mostly medication, supplies, food and water, because everyone needs to be self-sustainable going in, and those things were just went through some X-ray scanners, and then once we were on the other side, we were picked up by some Ministry of Health ambulances, and then off we went to one of the hospitals. Initially, we stayed at the Emirati Maternity Hospital for the first night, just as a place before they could place us, and then the rest of the time we stayed at a primary care clinic in Rafah, where we primarily worked out of, and worked out of another school clinic as well. These clinics typically saw, the larger clinic, which is actually a clinic, I think sees around like 200 patients per person. like per physician, and that one's a little bit bigger. And then the school clinic, we were seeing about 60 to 70 patients per half day, which is about 3-4 hours. And the school clinic was, I call it a school clinic because it was based at a school. And this is no longer a school because no one's in classrooms. And it's just completely housing all these internally displaced people. And this clinic happens to be there because this is where people are. That clinic, I think, shed a lot of light for me on the gaps of just like there were no antibiotics and just like so many children that had hepatitis A, and just could only get IV fluid. There was just so much IV fluid. Like there were boxes and boxes of IV fluid at the clinic that we stayed at as well. And we were so perplexed, and we were just, asking around, why is there so much IV fluid? And it's because there are different states, different organizations that want to look like they're helping. And so they just give things that they don't honestly need, that actually do not help, and say, oh, we brought all these things to Gaza. But I think it's another layer of it is what is actually approved in. And these things were approved in because I don't know, why not approve more water? but children were dehydrated and starving, and all they could get is IV fluid. That's what we were doing in the school clinic, is that these children were so dehydrated and starving, and they have some kind of infectious disease, a respiratory infection, a gastrointestinal infection. Like when we were there was a UNICEF report that already showed and shared that over 90% of children under the age of 5 had one or more infectious diseases. And to not have food and water and shelter, it's like a death sentence, or close to one. And to kind of get to that point of like severe malnutrition, and to only have IV fluid, it's like torture. Like these children are skin and bones, and the nurses would have to like lift up the legs of a child, because this increases the volume of the upper body, so that they could try to actually access a vein, because the veins are so thin, or not thin, but there's just like no volume, right? To put a venous line in, which hurts. And so the child is in distress, the parents in distress, seeing their child that's like malnourished and ill and like having some kind of disease of like throwing up or like coughing or having diarrhea because no one has clean water. And then to get some IV fluid is like all that can happen. There's just no words for, and that was 4 weeks ago. That was in mid-February when I was there. Right. And the conditions continue to worsen. And that was also in Rafah, where this is like supposed to be a green area or a safe area. We know that there's no safe area in Gaza. And it wasn't even until we left Gaza the week after did we start hearing the official reports of children having died from severe malnutrition in the north. And I can tell you from what we saw in Rafah then, there were probably children that already died in Rafah from severe malnutrition, but we just didn't see them because you actually have to be well enough to get to a clinic or a hospital and then die in front of a doctor or a nurse for your number to be counted, right? Like that's when we talk about the numbers of people dead or killed, like it's such a gross underestimate. Like not only just like thinking about the people that are trapped under rubble and then don't get discovered until later, like the only ways in which they're counting these children that have died in the north is that they happen to be in a hospital and to have died in front of someone that can actually tally them, count them, report that to WHO, report that to the Ministry of Health. And so there must be like children and other people that just do not have the privilege to actually get to a hospital or a clinic. And there's also so many hospitals and clinics that are just inaccessible because they're surrounded by Israeli military that are attacking it. So no one can enter and no one can exit, and then anything that moves gets hit by gunfire. Yeah, so it's a long answer to your question.
That was perfect, actually. Thank you so much.
So during your time in Rafah, did you at any point interact with Israelis? Did you see them? Did they check you? And what was your impression of these people? I mean, there must be some conscience somewhere.
Yeah, so during our time there, we did not interact with any Israeli soldiers because that would have been too dangerous. The strange thing is, like, the United Nations, the WHO, who coordinate our whereabouts, that they know where our whereabouts are so desperately afraid for something like that to happen. To actually come into contact with an Israeli military group, essentially, could be a death sentence. It certainly would mean detainment and to be arrested and tortured, because that's what they've done to healthcare workers that they come across in the hospitals. If you don't abandon your patients, or you just get executed in front of your patients. And these are the reports that are coming from Al Shifa. And so there's these different trigger points for the international organizations, including the UN and WHO, where if the ground invasion, if physical Israeli soldiers are coming into close proximity to any international worker on the ground, then it's a trigger point for actually evacuation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being there. Thank you for being so brave. You're famous. We all know you. So we're happy that you're here. And mashallah, I'm going to say it in Arabic. You're so articulate, and you gave us such a good description of the challenges that we are seeing as a medical community here, as doctors, as medical students, when we try to speak up about Gaza. You're also giving us a really good idea about what it's like to actually be there. It is unimaginable, and I had chills listening to you. So I appreciate you as a witness. I am Palestinian. I'm from Nablus. And our medical associations failed us. The medical associations are more concerned about profit margins, insurance contracts, end-of-life care, whether to make it more expensive, less expensive. And there is no humanity in this, as far as I can see it. And we are in a desperate need for a new form of medical care that is human, that is moral, and that takes everybody into consideration. And I think we're ready for a revolution, a medical revolution. My question to you is, have you thought of that? Are there venues for that? I have thoughts of my own, and I'm happy to speak to anyone here about it, because we have been organizing a lot in the medical community, but I'm also interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your kind and generous words. I think a lot too about this, like, how do we co-create and actually reimagine, and like, we know, like, communities of care, even within professional spaces, let alone medicine, but also just generally within society too. We have the power to do that as individuals and as groups of people and coalitions. And because we know that these authority figures, these people who choose not to use or exercise leadership, people that hold institutional power, they're not going to do it. So we have to do it on our own, and it ultimately comes, I think, from a place of deep respect and care for one another, and deepening those relationships and co-creating those spaces. I think a good place to start at least from my experience, is through the organizing that people are coming together around Palestine for, knowing that we're 5-6 months into the ongoing genocide, and honestly, but also realistically, people are getting tired. And so how do we build more sustainability? How do we think about long-term strategy? How do we think about ensuring that people are looked after, so that we can also utilize these ways of that we've built new connections, but also utilize them for other ways to build strength and power within community. And in Canada, I'm connected with a group of healthcare workers that are organizing for Palestine, and it's launched into all these different areas and kind of ways in which we can think about supporting healthcare learners, through elective opportunities, or through even having a group that is dedicated to youth, and how do you so it's all these different ways in which you can almost co-create and reimagine your own kind of association or organization, but without perpetuating the master's tools of patriarchy, racism, colonialism ourselves. But it's also very hard sometimes to do that, because it's sometimes all we've known in this society as well, that is so capitalistic and extractive, and is always about, ultimately always about profit over people. And so how do we change that narrative is going to be endless work, unfortunately, but it is possible work. I certainly hope and believe that. But we have to be able to be in these spaces where we can make mistakes and then acknowledge those mistakes and have other people teach and learn with us. And then so we can grow to create these spaces that also welcome more and more people in to kind of reimagine. But it's so interconnected with all these other movements, right, for freedom from structural oppression. Thinking about people who are structurally without a home or homeless, people who are underhoused, people who experience severe mental health or disability, and are cast aside as not human in the most pervasive ways of being excluded from society. And so all of these ways in which we can build solidarity and actually co-create a world that does not put profit over people and does the opposite of that, is I think ultimately the path forward, is ultimately what Gaza is paying the worst price for, but is freeing a lot of people from all these cracks in society that were always there, but is being made so very apparent that political motivations or economic motivations, these things mean nothing when basic human rights can't be respected. But that's also happening here, right? You think about environmental extractive projects, we talk about pipelines in Canada, and why are we talking about pipelines when it's poisoning people's water? We have in Canada, there's undrinkable water in many First Nations communities. And so there's all these different ways in which we can also build solidarity, is also the path forward for co-creating. But I would love to hear your ideas as well, and we can strategize. And the last thing I'll say is it's another way in which I'm realizing people are organizing is around a genocide. There's a conference next week that I'm attending that is specifically focused on genocide and specifically focused on Gaza, and people. I hope it's okay that I'm saying it, but it's in Texas. It's in Houston, and so there's going to be human rights lawyers. There's going to be medical professionals. There's going to be educators, and it's through bearing witness as well. Like I've provided written, verbal testimony to investigators and to human rights lawyers that are putting those cases together for the ICJ and the ICC. And so there are all these different ways in which we bear witness and we practice solidarity work. And it's never ending, because these structural systems were not made in a day, and they won't be dismantled in a day. But it's through like reimagining what we as individuals and as communities can actually co-create. And I really believe that we can do that work.
Thank you. I think what we need is energy, persistent, and to be active, and to keep Gaza alive, and to keep human rights alive. Yeah. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I'm recognizing that we're 10 minutes over. If you have any further questions, you're welcome to come up and talk to Dr. Guh, but I think we're going to end it there. Can I get a round of applause? Thank you all for coming.
I also wanted to say that we started two student groups since last semester. One is Medical Students for Palestine, and one is Students for Health Equity and Human Rights. So if you would like to join, we would love your help. This is only a first of a series. We are going to try to focus on cross-cultural solidarity. So each time we're going to try to bring in a new group of people, and I see new faces that I haven't seen before. So this is really exciting, and it's kind of working. So thank you for coming here, and we'll stay in touch. If you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, please let me know, and I'll add you to the list. Thank you so much.